The autumn ball at Lanford House had been lit for 300 guests, and Marian Graves stood among them like a woman built into the wall. She wore half-mourning, a gown of pale lavender that had been her mother-in-law's before the seams were taken in, and she held her brother's youngest child on her hip with the practiced stillness of someone who understood that drawing attention was no longer a thing her life permitted. The child, barely 2, had one fist wound into the lace at her collar. Her brother's elder daughters, 6 and 8, pressed against her skirts on either side, and together the 4 of them formed a kind of island the rest of the room flowed neatly around, without once touching. Marian's sister-in-law was dancing. Her brother was at the card tables. The musicians played a second set, and the candles above her had already begun to list in their sockets, and not one soul in the crush of silk and borrowed diamonds had spoken to her since the footman who took her cloak. She heard it before she saw who said it. Anne's voice, her sister-in-law's bright, confident whisper, carried from behind the nearest column. "Pay her no mind, Mrs. Felton. She is only the spinster aunt. Poor thing, she does try to make herself useful." Marian did not turn her head. She adjusted the child's weight on her hip and kept her gaze on the dancers. Her pulse climbed once, hard, into the base of her throat, and held there. She was 24 years old. Her husband had been dead for 8 months. The season called her aunt, and the word had begun to fit the way a too large borrowed gown fits, not because it belonged to her, not because it described anything true about her body or her years, but because no one present had reason to argue with it. Across the room, at the edge of the dancers and slightly apart from the circle of men surrounding him, Lord Marcus Ashworth, Marquis of Harlow, turned his head. He had not been watching her. He had been watching nothing in particular. His face closed and still in the way it had been closed, and still for 2 full years. And then his gaze found the woman in lavender with the child on her hip. And it stopped. He did not smile. He did not approach. He looked at her the way a man looks at an open wound he recognizes, not from medicine, not from curiosity. And the quality of his attention was so precise that Marian, who was not looking at him, felt the weight of it land against the side of her face like the warmth from a fire she had not been invited to sit beside. She did not look. The child pulled at her collar. She pressed her cheek to the child's hair, and her hand steadied itself against the small warm back, and her breathing, which had been measured and deliberate all evening, lost its rhythm for exactly 1 beat before she recovered it. What she did not yet know, what the season's gossip would not have told her, because the season did not trade in the private griefs of men who held their faces like carved granite, was that Lord Ashworth had a wound of his own, and that the wound had taught him to watch for the thing that no one else in a room was watching. If you have ever stood at the edge of a room and felt the particular weight of being unseen, stay close. Something is about to change for Marian Graves that will change the shape of her life entirely. The invitation to Lanford House had not been hers. It had been her brother's, extended on the strength of his wife's family connections, and accepted on the condition that someone tend the children so that Anne might dance and Philip might play. Marian had understood the condition without it being spoken aloud. She had understood it the way she understood all the conditions of her new life, by the quality of silence that followed a request. No one asked Marian to stay home with the children. No one asked Marian to give up her evening. The children were simply mentioned, the ball was mentioned after them, and the pause between the 2 mentions was the shape of the question no one needed to voice. She had been Mrs. Thomas Graves for 11 months before Thomas died, a curate's wife in a parish west of Bath, with a garden she had planted herself, and a front room where the light came through in the afternoons in a way that made her believe the life she had chosen, modest and quiet, and far from the season she had never been granted, was enough. Thomas had been kind. Thomas had been thin and pale and prone to coughing fits that worsened through the winter, and she had loved him with the steady, unsurprising love of a woman who understood that she had married a man who would not live to be old. He died in February. His family reclaimed the cottage in March. Her jointure was £40 a year, and her brother had taken her in with the efficiency of a man settling a minor account. A room on the 3rd floor near the nursery, a place at the table provided she helped with the children, and a silence around the subject of how long the arrangement might last. The ivory comb in her hair had been her mother's. It was small, plain, unfashionable, its teeth slightly yellowed, and she wore it every evening because it was the only thing she owned that had not come from someone else's generosity or someone else's death. Anne had once suggested she leave it at home. Marian had said nothing. She had worn it the next evening and the evening after that, and Anne had not mentioned it again. At the ball, Marian managed the children through the 2nd and 3rd sets with the competence that came from practice rather than from any natural ease. She wiped a small mouth with the edge of her sleeve. She answered a question about stars from the elder girl. She kept the younger one from pulling a tablecloth. She did all of this while standing, because no one had offered her a chair, and her shoes, which had been Thomas's wedding gift and were wearing thin at the heel, pressed against the marble floor with a faint ache she had stopped noticing weeks ago. The terrace doors had been opened against the heat of the candles, and the October air came through in a thin, cold line that found the back of her neck, where the gown did not quite cover. At 10:30, the youngest child began to cry, not the sharp, startled cry of pain, just the low, dragging wail of a small body pushed past its patience, and Marian shifted the child higher on her hip and moved toward the terrace without waiting for permission, because permission was another thing that had stopped applying to her, and the cool air and the dark and the quiet would be enough to settle the child if she could hold her for 5 uninterrupted minutes. The terrace was not empty. Lord Ashworth stood at the stone railing with one hand resting on it, his back to the doors, his posture so still that in the dim light he might have been part of the architecture. Marian stopped in the doorway. The child wailed once more, softer now against her shoulder, and the sound crossed the terrace and reached him, and he turned. His face was composed. His eyes were not. "Come inside," he said. His voice was low, clipped, carrying the flat authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed in rooms far larger than this terrace. "The child is cold." Marian stiffened. "She is not cold, my lord. She is tired. The air will settle her." "Then sit down." He gestured, one short motion toward the stone bench along the wall. It was not a request. She heard only the command in it, and not the thing the command was built around, which was that he had seen her standing for 3 hours and had not once seen anyone offer her a chair. She sat, the child quieted against her shoulder. The silence on the terrace held the particular quality of 2 people aware of each other's breathing, without acknowledging it, and Marian kept her eyes on the garden below, because looking at him felt like a thing that would cost her something she could not afford. He remained at the railing. He did not speak again. After several minutes, the child's breathing evened into sleep, and Marian stood and walked past him without a word. And his hand, resting on the stone, shifted exactly once as she passed, a small, unconscious adjustment that no one in the lit room beyond would have noticed or understood. The morning after the ball, a note arrived at her brother's house. It was addressed to Mrs. Graves and bore the seal of Harlow Park. Philip opened it at breakfast because post addressed to persons under his roof was, by his reckoning, post addressed to his household. He read it aloud while Marian poured tea for the children. Lord Ashworth had written to inquire whether Mrs. Graves might be available to assist Mrs. Lennox, his housekeeper, with the cataloging of the Harlow Park Library, as the collection required someone with a careful hand and a knowledge of letters, and his own staff were occupied with preparations for the winter season. The compensation named was generous, more generous than £40 a year. Philip looked at Marian over the top of the page with the particular expression of a man calculating the value of an inconvenience he had not expected to be relieved of. Anne said nothing, which was its own form of commentary. Marian went to Harlow Park the following Tuesday. The library was vast, cold, and filled with the particular kind of dust that accumulates on books no one has touched in years. Mrs. Lennox, a tall woman with gray hair pinned in a severe knot and a voice that carried the authority of 3 decades in service, met her at the door and walked her through the collection with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had been told to be kind and was managing it through competence rather than warmth. The shelves ran floor to ceiling across 4 walls, and the light from the tall windows fell in slanting columns that lit the dust and made the room feel like a church. Marian touched the spine of a volume of Cowper and felt, for the first time since February, something that was not grief or duty. Lord Ashworth did not appear that first morning. He appeared the second morning, standing in the library doorway with a cup of tea he did not offer her, watching her shelve a stack of sermons with a care that the sermons probably did not deserve. She was on a low ladder. Her sleeves were pushed to her elbows. Her mother's ivory comb held her hair, and a streak of dust ran along her jaw where she had wiped her face with the back of her hand. He watched her for 4 full minutes before she noticed him. In that time, she spoke to Mrs. Lennox, who was passing through with linens, and asked whether the scullery girl, a thin child of perhaps 14, whom Marian had seen crying in the corridor, had been given breakfast. Mrs. Lennox said the girl had been scolded for breaking a dish and sent to the kitchen without. Marian set down the sermons. She climbed down from the ladder. She crossed the room to where a tray of bread and cold meat had been left for her own use, and she made a plate with steady hands and carried it to the corridor and told the scullery girl to eat. And her voice was so quiet and so firm that the girl took the plate without argument. Lord Ashworth had not moved from the doorway. His face was still. His hand, the one not holding the teacup, had closed into a fist at his side, the knuckles white. And when Marian turned and saw him standing there, his face rearranged itself into the mask so smoothly that she read only disapproval in it. "I hope I have not overstepped, my lord." "Eat something yourself, Mrs. Graves," he said, and turned and left the room. And she stood in the dust-filled light and did not understand what had just happened. And her heart, which had been steady all morning, was suddenly loud in her ears. Lady Ashworth arrived at Harlow Park 4 days later. The Dowager Marchioness had not been expected until Christmas, and her early arrival carried the particular energy of a woman who had received intelligence that required immediate correction. She was tall, silver-haired, immaculate in dark green silk, and she entered the drawing-room where her son sat reading with the authority of a woman who had been managing this household since before he inherited it. Behind her came Miss Georgiana Felton, 20 years old, golden-haired, the daughter of Lady Ashworth's closest friend, and the woman the Dowager had selected for the next Marchioness of Harlow, with the same confidence with which she selected the menus and the draperies and the arrangement of chairs in the front hall. Marian was in the library when she heard the carriage. She did not come out. She was not required to come out. And the shape of her position, a paid assistant, a widow of no consequence, a woman whose presence in the house was transactional and temporary, made the drawing-room as remote from her as the moon. The Dowager found her anyway. 2 hours after her arrival, Lady Ashworth appeared at the library door and surveyed Marian with the composed, thorough gaze of a woman accustomed to assessing the threat level of every female in proximity to her son. Marian stood from the cataloging desk. She curtsied. She felt the blood leave her face and settle somewhere low in her stomach, where it could not help her. "You are the widow they have cataloging the books," Lady Ashworth said. It was not a question. "Yes, my lady." "How old are you?" 24, my lady." The dowager's expression adjusted itself by a single degree, a faint tightening at the corners of her mouth that communicated surprise and revised calculation in the same instant. 24, she repeated. "I was told the librarian was a spinster aunt from the village. Are you not a spinster aunt, Mrs. Graves?" Marian's hands, folded at her waist, did not move. "I am a widow, my lady. I am also an aunt. The rest is the season's interpretation." Lady Ashworth smiled. It did not reach her eyes. She turned and left the library with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had identified the problem and already begun composing the solution, and Marian stood beside the cataloging desk and pressed her palms flat against the surface, and breathed, and breathed, and breathed again, until the trembling in her hands was something she could manage. The following week proceeded with the quiet inevitability of a siege. Lady Ashworth moved through the household, rearranging everything she touched. The breakfast hour was restructured around Miss Felton's preferences. The afternoon tea was relocated to the morning room, where Miss Felton could be displayed to best advantage against the pale silk drapes. The dinner conversation was steered, with the precision of a helmsman in a narrow channel, toward subjects that showcased Miss Felton's accomplishments and her family's connections, and the geography of her father's estate in Hampshire. And each new arrangement was another stone laid in the wall the dowager was building between her son and the woman in the library. Miss Felton herself was not unkind. She was 20 years old, and had been raised to believe that the path she was walking was the only path available, and her confidence had the fragile particular quality of something that has never been tested, because no one has ever suggested it might fail. She played the pianoforte in the evenings. She laughed at the correct moments. She wore her hair in the fashion the season approved, and her gowns in the colors the dowager selected, and she did not once visit the library, because the library was where the widow worked, and the widow was not a person whose existence the morning room acknowledged. Marian continued her cataloging, arriving each morning at 9 and leaving each afternoon at 4. With each passing day, the distance between herself and the rest of the house grew more pronounced, more deliberate, more carefully maintained. She ate alone. She entered through the side door. She spoke to Mrs. Lennox and to the scullery girl, and to no one else. Lord Ashworth came to the library every morning at 10:30. He stood in the doorway or sat in the leather chair by the fireplace and read, or did not read, and the quality of his attention, which Marian could feel the way one feels a change in the weather, was deniable precisely because he never spoke of it. He asked her questions about the cataloging. He asked whether she had eaten. Once, when she reached for a volume on a high shelf and the ladder shifted beneath her foot, he crossed the room in 2 strides and steadied the ladder with his hand, and the heat of his body reached her through the cold library air like a sentence she could not translate, and she climbed down and said thank you, and did not look at his face, because looking at his face had become a risk she was beginning to understand. "Walk with me," he said one afternoon, standing at the library window where the November light was already failing. "The garden path is not long. You have been inside since 9. She should have refused. A paid assistant does not walk in the garden with the Marquis of Harlow while the Dowager Marchioness watches from the morning room window. She went. The path wound along a yew hedge, and the air smelled of frost and turned earth, and they walked in silence for several minutes. She was aware of him beside her with a precision that embarrassed her. The exact distance between his shoulder and hers. The rhythm of his stride, longer than hers, deliberately slowed to match. The way his breath came visible in the cold air and dissipated before it reached her, and the way her own breath seemed to move toward his before the wind took it. She kept her hands clasped at her waist. She kept her eyes on the path. She kept the flush that had started at the base of her throat. The moment his hand brushed the gate open and held it for her, contained beneath the collar of her pelisse where it could not betray her. He spoke. And what he said was not what she expected. "I had a sister," he said. "Catherine. She married a man the family approved. A man with the correct name and the correct fortune and the correct manner at dinner. And I endorsed the match because I did not look past the surface of him. She wrote to me once, near the end. A letter. She tried to tell me what he was, and I read the letter and thought she was being dramatic, and I wrote back and told her to have patience. His voice did not change. The level, clipped quality of it held, and that was worse than any break would have been. She died in childbed, he said. The child survived. The husband did not contest the funeral arrangements. Marian stopped walking. She looked at him, and for the first time since they had met, she saw past the mask and into the wound beneath it. And the wound was not coldness, not remoteness, not the aristocratic disinterest the season attributed to him. The wound was guilt. He carried the letter still. She could see the shape of it in his breast pocket, folded small and kept close, the way a man carries a debt he intends to pay for the rest of his life. "My lord," she said. "I did not see," he said, his voice low. "I have since learned to see. I will not make that error again." They stood on the garden path in the failing light, and Marian understood, with a clarity that arrived in her body before it reached her mind, that he was not speaking about his sister. He was speaking about her. He was telling her that he saw what the room refused to see, that the spinster aunt was a fiction the season had written across a woman who was grieving and young and alone, and worth more than the borrowed gown and the third-floor room and the £40 a year. And the knowledge moved through her like warmth returning to a hand held too long in cold water. And she could not speak. If this story has found you at a moment when you needed it, a small sign that you are seen, consider leaving a like or sharing it with someone who might need it too. The reckoning came on a Tuesday. Lady Ashworth arranged a dinner at Harlow Park for 12 guests, the families of the county whose opinions formed the architecture of the local season, and she arranged the seating with surgical precision. Miss Felton was placed at Lord Ashworth's right hand. Marian was not invited. Marian was, in fact, told by the dowager's maid that her cataloging services would not be required that day, and Marian understood the message inside the message and stayed in her brother's house and sat in the third-floor room and held her mother's comb in her hands and did not cry, because crying was another thing that had stopped being available to her. The dinner proceeded. She was not there to see it, and so the account came to her later, through the scullery girl, who had been told by the kitchen maid, who had heard it from the footman. The story traveled the servants' corridor with the speed and specificity that only servants' gossip achieves, and what it told her was this. Lady Ashworth had raised a glass during the fish course and spoken of her son's future. She had named Miss Felton as the natural and expected choice for the next Marchioness. She had described the match as settled in all respects save the formal announcement. And then, in the warm laughter that followed, someone had asked about the widow who had been seen at the house, and Lady Ashworth had said, with the smile that did not reach her eyes, "The spinster aunt? She catalogues books, Mrs. Drake. I assure you, that is the full extent of her connection to this family." The girl told Marian this in the kitchen of her brother's house, standing with her hands twisted in her apron, and Marian listened and said nothing and set down the cup of tea she was holding with such care that it did not rattle in the saucer. The girl left. The kitchen was quiet. Marian sat at the scrub table and looked at the wall and felt the word land for the third time. Spinster aunt. And this time, it did not sting, and it did not cut. It closed a door. It was the sound of a world she had allowed herself. Briefly, and against every warning her own experience had taught her, to imagine she might be admitted to, locking itself against her with a finality that left no room for appeal. She had been seen. She had been known. And the seeing and the knowing had changed nothing, because the season's verdict was louder than any one man's private attention, and the dowager's confidence was the confidence of a woman who understood that structure outlasts sentiment every time. That night, Marian wrote a letter. She addressed it to Lord Ashworth and gave it to the footman at Harlow Park the following morning. The letter was brief. It thanked him for the employment. It stated that the cataloguing was nearly complete, and that she would finish by the end of the week. It said nothing of gardens or sisters or letters carried in breast pockets, and it did not say what she needed it to say, which was that she could not continue to stand in his library and feel the quality of his attention, and know that the world he moved through had no room in it for a woman whose name had already been decided for her by people with louder voices and more confident smiles. She went to the library one final time. She shelved the last of the volumes. She straightened the catalogue and left it on the desk. She was reaching for her cloak when the door opened, and it was not Mrs. Lennox. Lord Ashworth held her letter in his hand. His face was the mask. His eyes were not. "You are leaving," he said. "The work is finished, my lord." "The work," he repeated, and the word carried a weight that had nothing to do with books. He crossed the room. He stopped 3 paces from her. 3 paces that she felt in the base of her spine, in the quickening of her pulse, in the specific awareness of exactly where his hand was in relation to hers. "Mrs. Graves. Marian." She flinched. Not from fear. From the sound of her given name in his mouth, spoken deliberately, spoken as a marked thing, a name reclaimed from the wreckage of aunt and widow, and poor thing and spinster. Her eyes burned. She held. "Your mother chose well," he said. "A spinster aunt. They are fools, and I will no longer permit it. You cannot stop people from speaking, my lord. I can ensure they speak differently." She shook her head. "I am a curate's widow with £40 a year and a borrowed room in my brother's house. Miss Felton is everything your family requires. I am everything your family has decided I am, and no amount of library work or garden walks will change what they see when they look at me." It was the first true thing she had said to him. It cost her everything she had left. He was silent for a long moment. Then he reached into his breast pocket and drew out the folded letter, Catherine's letter, and held it in his open palm between them. "The last time I failed to act on what I saw," he said, "my sister died. I will not fail again." The Harlow Christmas Ball was the final event of the county season, and it was held in the same ballroom where Marian had stood against the wall with her brother's children and heard herself named as the spinster aunt. The room was lit with twice the candles. The musicians played from the gallery. Lady Ashworth stood at the entrance in silver silk, receiving guests with Miss Felton at her side, and the whole of the county's good opinion was arranged around them like a stage set, and Marian was not expected, was not invited, was not in any version of this evening that the dowager had designed. She came anyway. She wore a gown that Mrs. Lennox had pressed for her, a deep blue that had belonged to someone in the Harlow household, and that fit her as though it had been made for the purpose, and her mother's ivory comb held her hair, and she entered through the front doors, and the footman announced her name, and the room turned. Lady Ashworth's face did not move. Her hand, holding a glass of wine, tightened by a single degree. Miss Felton, at her side, looked at Marian with the expression of a woman seeing, for the first time, the specific shape of the obstacle she had not been told existed. Marian stood in the doorway. She did not advance. She did not retreat. The blood roared in her ears, and her knees were unreliable, and her breathing had abandoned any pretense of steadiness, and she stood there because standing there was the only act of defiance left available to a woman with 40 pounds a year and a plain ivory comb, and the stubborn refusal to disappear from a room she had every right to enter. The dowager moved first. She crossed toward Marian with the measured confidence of a woman about to deliver a correction so thorough it would never need repeating, and her voice, when it came, was pitched to carry across the nearby clusters of guests. "Mrs. Graves, I do not believe you were included in this evening's arrangements. The library is closed for the season." Marian opened her mouth. She did not know what she was going to say. She did not need to. Lord Ashworth had been standing at the far side of the ballroom beside the senior magistrate and two men whose names Marian did not know. He was not standing there any longer. He was crossing the room. The crowd parted for him the way a crowd parts for a man whose rank precedes him like weather, and the room went quiet in stages, the music still playing from the gallery, the conversations dropping one by one as heads turned to follow him, and he reached Marian in the silence he had created by the simple act of walking toward her when every convention in the room required him to walk in the opposite direction. He stopped beside her. He turned to face the room. His jaw was set. His hand, at his side, found hers, and his fingers closed around her fingers with a pressure that was not gentle and not possessive, and was something for which she did not have a word, only the physical fact of his hand holding hers in front of every person who had ever called her spinster, aunt, widow, poor thing, nobody. Mrs. Graves will be the next Marchioness of Harlow. The words landed in the silence the way a stone lands in still water. A single ripple, then another. Then the whole surface moved. Lady Ashworth's mouth opened. No sound came out. Her hand, the one holding the glass, lowered slowly to her side, and the glass tilted, and a thin line of wine ran down her wrist, and she did not notice. And for the first time in Marian's experience, the Dowager Marchioness of Harlow looked like a woman whose script had failed her entirely. Miss Felton stepped back. Her face was white, not with rage, with the particular stunned recognition of a woman who understood, in a single instant, that the thing she had been promised was a thing the promising party had never been authorized to give. The magistrate, an older man with a kind, weathered face, inclined his head once, and the nod carried the weight of procedural confirmation, and Marian felt it land like an anchor thrown into deep water. The room exhaled. A murmur moved through the crowd. Not the scandalized whisper of people witnessing a mistake. The low, settling hum of people recognizing something they had been waiting to see. Without knowing, they were waiting. Mrs. Drake, who had laughed at the dowager's fish course remark, turned to her husband and said something Marian could not hear, and her expression was not mockery. It was the quiet shame of a woman who had repeated a cruelty she was now watching. Be corrected. Lady Ashworth drew one breath. Her voice, when it came, was smaller than Marian had ever heard it. "Marcus, this is not what was agreed." "Nothing was agreed, Mother," Lord Ashworth said. "Nothing was ever agreed. You agreed with yourself, and the room was too polite to correct you." The dowager looked at her son. She looked at Marian. She looked at their joined hands, and something in her posture, the rigid, silver-haired architecture of a woman who had held this household together by force of will, and the certainty that her categories were correct, shifted. Not collapsed. Shifted. The way a wall shifts when the ground beneath it moves and the wall does not fall, merely accommodates the new angle of the earth. She said nothing more. She turned and walked toward the far side of the room, and Miss Felton followed her, and the crowd opened a path for them with the same deference it had opened a path for Lord Ashworth a moment before, and the deference was identical, and the meaning of it was entirely different. Marian's hand was shaking inside his. He did not let go. He looked down at her, and for the first time since she had known him, the mask was gone entirely, and his face was open and grave and full of a tenderness so controlled it was almost severity. And he said nothing, because the moment did not require words. It required his hand around hers, and the room watching, and the simple fact that he had chosen, in the arena where the verdict had first been delivered, to deliver a different one. The snow came that night. It fell across the grounds of Harlow Park in the thin, particular silence that only first snow carries. And Marian sat in the library, in the leather chair by the fire that had been his chair every morning at 10:30. And the fire was low, and the room was warm, and the dust on the shelves she had catalogued caught the firelight and turned it gold. Lord Ashworth sat in the opposite chair. Between them, on the small table, lay Catherine's letter, unfolded for the first time in Marian's presence. And she had read it, and he had watched her read it. And the act of letting her see it was its own form of declaration, quieter than the one he had made in the ballroom, and more costly in the ways that do not require an audience. The ivory comb was still in her hair, was still in. He reached across the distance between them and touched it, one finger tracing the yellowed edge, and his hand was steady and warm, and she felt the touch travel from the comb through her hair to the base of her skull and settle there like a second heartbeat. "Your mother's," he said. "Yes." "You will wear it at the wedding." It was not a question. It was a command, and inside the command was the same thing that had always been inside his commands, the protection she had not recognized until now, the seeing she had spent 8 months believing was not possible for a woman the world had already decided not to see. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The library windows held the reflection of the fire and the 2 chairs and the 2 people in them. And the image doubled and softened in the glass the way a memory softens when it is finally allowed to become something other than grief. Mrs. Lennox brought tea and set it on the table without comment. The scullery girl, passing in the corridor, paused and looked through the open door and smiled, a small, quick smile that no one saw and no one needed to see. Marian Pemberton, who had been Mrs. Graves, who had been the spinster aunt, who had been the widow with 40 pounds in a borrowed room, closed her eyes in the warmth of the fire and felt the weight of the name she had carried for 8 months, the name the season had given her, the name that had never fit, lift from her shoulders like a garment she no longer needed to wear. The comb held her hair. The snow fell. The fire burned low and steady, and the house, which had been his house, began the slow, patient work of becoming hers. Thank you for staying until the end of Marian's story. If her journey touched you, leave a word in the comments, and know that it meant something to me that you were here.